and have a seat. What a beautiful moment of worship. That was good. I've always found myself in the second or third or fourth chair of leadership. I've always led, I've always been in that place of not the top. And I found myself even in certain positions, like one of my more recent ones, it wasn't even just the second or third or fourth chair of leadership, it was what I lovingly referred to as the junk drawer. Because if there was something that didn't have a home, you could just give it to Dan. He'll just take it. He'll do it well. He'll go forward with it. I mean, sometimes I found myself in 3 or 4 positions and moving all those things, but if I was honest, I would catch myself thinking about those who were over me, my boss or the leader or the senior pastor, because most of my career has been in ministry, and I would think, if I had their position, I would make different decisions. If I had their position, if I had their title, if I had their responsibilities, I would choose to do this thing, or I would choose to have done that differently, or I would definitely have not have done that, I would have done this, but if I had their position, but I don't have their position. In fact, sometimes I even caught myself thinking, I think I'm being kept back from everything that I could be doing. Like if I just was put into a different title, then I would be able to make some change. Then I would be able to get some things done. And then I was reminded of somebody who probably was maybe in a similar position, but in much different circumstances. And this person did not have position, they didn't have title, yet she found herself in front of some of the most powerful leaders of the entire world advocating for children in the slums of Calcutta. Mother Teresa stood up in front of the leaders of the entire United States, people who were in the position to be able to tell her what to do, in the position to be able to wield their power. Mother Teresa stands up in front of them and scolds them. I wish she were my grandma. Like, she just seems so cool. It's so cool because she doesn't have the position. She is not in the place to be able to wield power. She doesn't have the title. She is just a little old woman from the slums of Calcutta who has no power at all. She serves the weak. She serves the dying. She helps put orphans in families. She touches the untouchables. In fact, Mother Teresa was super, super low on the scale of importance. But here she finds herself standing in front of world leaders. And they're listening to her. Nobody is telling her to stop. Nobody is silencing her. They are drinking it in. Because there was something about Mother Teresa that held power. There was something that didn't come from her position that still made people listen to her. She still had influence so powerful that even world leaders sat still and listened. They gave her the floor. Mother Teresa did not walk with positional authority. Now, positional authority is something that we're actually quite familiar with. In our society, positional authority is what gets things done. If you want to get something done, you have to be in the chair to do it. If you want something done, you have to have the title, you have to have the authority, you have to have the power to get it done. You have to have that position. And you get that position a number of different ways. Some of us in our jobs have gotten there by working hard. It's our skills and it's our talents. There's other positions in society that people have gotten there because of their connections or their money. And in doing so, they were given the power that they seek. But power does something to people, doesn't it? Now, it's an old adage, maybe you guys can help me finish the statement. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, you guys know it. You guys know it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so what we find is we have people in a position of power all throughout society at high levels and even at low levels that are wielding this positional power. And what happens when they find themselves in there is what Plato quotes, Plato the philosopher quotes, going old school. The measure of a man is what he does with power. The measure of a man is what he does with power. You see, power has a curious thing that it does to us, is it does this. It reveals our character. That we can lament that maybe we don't have the power to get something done, but then once we do, once we find ourselves in a place of authority, once we receive that positional authority, that power reveals something about us. It changes us in some ways, but mostly it reveals. Author and pastor Andy Stanley says this in his book, Next Generation Leader. Everything really does look different when you are at the top. Power, money, success, fame, they are all intoxicants. And intoxicated people see the world differently. For the intoxicated leader, rules are for the common man, not for him. What was once unthinkable becomes necessary in light of what is at stake. What was once considered dishonest is seen as prudent in light of current reality. When questioned, his response is something along the lines of, "One day you'll understand." Does that sound familiar? This is what positional authority, this is what positional power brings with it. It brings with it this intoxicating effect. Now, it's very easy to get stuck at this world level kind of power thinking, you know what, I'm nowhere near that, Dan. That's great that you're talking about this intoxicating power. I am not in that place. I'm not leading a world, I'm not leading a state, I'm barely leading my own household, right? Like some of us feel there, but here's the reality. I can't tell you how many times I've said, one day you'll understand in regard to my kids. Right? It doesn't take this massive level of power for me to see some of these things in my own life. Wherever we have power because of our position, even if it's as a parent, our character is revealed. And my kids and your kids or your grandkids or when you were raising kids, they had to listen to you. Why? Because you're the parent. What's the go-to? Why do I have to do this? Because I said so. Right? Because there is something about kids, there is something about the people that we are leading, the people that we are in power over because of our position, that sometimes people just have to listen. But you want to know something interesting? Positional power has never brought true change. If we're talking in terms of the church, positional power has never been the source of revival in the church. Revival historically, whether it's in the Bible or throughout the pages of history, has never come from the top. It has never come from the man or the woman or the person in charge. It has never come from money. It has never come from connections. It has never come from a title or a position. Revival has always come out of the place in the hearts of men and women that are a little bit more like Mother Teresa. They find themselves leading not even in the third or fourth chair, maybe it's the 10th or 11th chair. I mean, if we look not super long ago in history, we can look at the Reformation with Martin Luther, and he was not the man. He was one of the guys, but he was not the man. There was something different about what he led that changed to an entire revitalization of the church and the birth of Protestantism in the world. That's a significant thing. There was something in Mother Teresa that allowed world power leaders holding position and title to sit down and listen. There's a different kind of authority. We call it moral authority. So we have positional authority, positional power, that comes from things like the position that we hold. Maybe it's in a business or an organization. It's when people have to do what you say because you're in charge. But then there's moral authority, and moral authority comes from an entirely different place. It comes from the very innermost being of who we are. It comes from our character. This is what actually changes things. This is what brings renewal. And if we are going to see revival in our day in the church, this is the kind of character we need to develop, because it's the kind of character that goes well beyond positional authority, and it's the place of real influence. It's not the do this because I told you so. It's the come and follow me. Let's go. And people listen. But the question is, how do we get there? How do we get moral authority? Well, we've been walking through the book of Matthew a lot. We're going to go there again today. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 7. We're going to read a handful of verses here, starting at verse 24. Matthew 7:24 says this, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who has built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. So we have some stuff going on here. We find ourselves at the end. If your Bible has red letters in it, if you flip back through the pages, you're going to see all sorts of red letters preceding this. That means that Jesus has been talking for a while. What we find ourselves here is at the end of one of the most famous teachings of Jesus, one of his most famous sermons called the Sermon on the Mount. Another gospel lists it as the Sermon on the Plain. At any rate, there were a large group of people listening to Jesus for quite a while. Jesus gave a lot of rich and beautiful instructions and teachings. He reframed a lot of the Jewish law in this. And then he gets to the end and he sums it all up with this. "If anyone hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, he's like a wise person who builds their house on bedrock." Now, have you ever been in the water and had waves washing up against you? And this was a regular occurrence for us in Lake Michigan. We would just stand there as the waves were washing up on the shore, and you would stand on the soft sand. And as the waves just came, it would like wash the sand out from under your feet and wrap it around them. And you just kind of sank a little bit deeper. Guess what that's not good for? Construction, right? Like there, you could go along the coast over the last few years. Lake Michigan had been eroding a lot of the bluff, a lot of the sand dunes, and people had built their houses on there, and there were whole communities that were being abandoned because half the house now is hanging over the edge of the sand, waiting to fall in because the waves are powerful. They thought they were safe, but they had not built on good foundation. Maybe the construction materials had all been good, but they chose to build on sand, and sand is easily washed away. That's the metaphor Jesus is giving for somebody who obediently follows the words of Jesus. They will not be like the foolish person who builds on sand. They will be somebody who builds on bedrock, that when the water comes, when adversity in life comes, it can't wash away the foundation. It's stable, it's good, it's strong. Jesus gives us point one of how to develop moral authority. It's in obedience to his teachings. Obedience isn't having anything other than doing what you're told, right? Now, Jesus doesn't command it, he just simply offers it. He said a lot of things like, "You've heard it said this, but I tell you this. Very truly, I tell you, do this." Jesus is pointing to himself as an authority and saying, in me is a fulfillment and an obedience that you can find to have a different way of life. To live out a different pattern in your life. Be obedient to me. This is like moral authority. This is character building 101, is be obedient to Jesus. When Jesus finishes saying all these things, he's talking about the wise man and the foolish man and the foundations. There's a little bit of commentary on what is happening around that. So Jesus finishes talking, and then the author Matthew describes what the atmosphere was like in the crowds. He says the crowds were amazed at his teaching. They were astonished. They were just captivated. Now, this isn't completely foreign to Jesus' time. There were lots of people who could build a following. There were a lot of people who could gather a crowd. In fact, if the emperor were to come, he would have a bigger crowd than Jesus. There were great orators of Jesus' time. I mean, we're following on the heels of Greek culture. We're in solid Greco-Roman culture where oration and speeches and learning to speak with a mouthful of pebbles but still being clear in your diction, like this ruled the orator's circle. There were people who were very polished in their skills. There were people that had to be listened to because of their authority, because of their position. But these people listening to Jesus were amazed. In fact, they were amazed because Jesus taught as someone who had authority, not as their scribes and teachers of the law, not as the Pharisees and as the Sadducees, not as the other people who drew a crowd. There was something qualitatively different about Jesus. Now, one of the things that we've learned is that part of the difference that showed Jesus' authorities versus the other teachers was that other teachers would oftentimes reference other people's authority. So a scribe or a teacher of the law would stand up, and as he's giving a teaching from the Torah or the prophets, he would reference somebody else's authority. Maybe it was Moses's, or oftentimes it was just the law in general, or maybe he referenced another one of the prophets that had written, and he would reference their authority to speak the word, but not Jesus. Jesus said those things like, very truly, I tell you. You have heard it said this, but I am telling you this. There was a qualitative difference in the words that Jesus spoke. He pointed to himself as the authority. He pointed to himself as the person that righteousness, right relationship with God could be found. Now that's what the text tells us, but I think there's something different here as well. You see, if you pay attention to Jesus' life, you're going to notice something, and I think this is really what this amazement from the crowds is getting at. Because we know something about Jesus. We know a few things about Jesus, really. Number one, from prophecy, we know that he wasn't somebody that was going to wield his position. Right? So Jesus isn't up there telling you, you have to do this because I told you to do it. Now, there may be an element of that because guess what? Jesus is God. So, that carries some weight. But prophecy also tells us about Jesus that he was not an attractive person. He wasn't going to be somebody that in and of himself, just in his skills and how he looked and his status, it wasn't going to draw people to him. There was something else that drew people to him. There was something else that made people captivated by the teachings of Jesus. There was something else that Jesus had that was considered authority. You see, people watched Jesus. They watched him live. Honestly, his disciples would watch him sleep. They would watch him pray. They would watch him preach and hear his words, and then they would see him act in power. They would see his declaration and his demonstration of the kingdom. In fact, there was a group of people who were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus of sin, of blasphemy, of being wrong, so that they could accuse him in front of courts and his life would be forfeit. They were looking for that. People were watching Jesus, but guess what? They could not find anything wrong. They couldn't find a single wrong thing in Jesus. It's so extreme that even when Jesus is on trial before the local rulers, that they have to bring false witnesses to lie, and even then their stories don't line up. They could not find anything wrong in Jesus' living. People saw that. So when Jesus says, I tell you this, there's a reason for authority. Jesus had moral authority. His authority was qualitatively different than the other teachers. You see, they could draw a crowd. That's what position does. Position can actually attract an audience. Position and title can actually gather people together. In fact, if we're going to pull one main point out of this, it's this: your position may bring an audience, but it's your character that brings authority. Your position can bring an audience, but it is your character that brings authority. This is what we see in Jesus. It's why his teachings are spoken, and it amazes the crowds, and he carries this authority because he was a person of deep character. Nobody could find fault in Jesus. And it was powerful, so people were amazed and they listened to what he said. His words had different weight to them than the other teachers did because they were referencing other people, but Jesus not only referenced himself, he had the power in his own living to back it up. I want to take another look at somebody else who had a lot of moral authority, one of Jesus' followers, well known. His name's Paul. So we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to start at verse 24 again. 1 Corinthians 9:24 says this: "Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the game goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." So Paul gives us another insight into how to develop moral authority. Paul is somebody with moral authority. In fact, if you look through the other letters that Paul has written as he is writing to the churches that he's been through, sometimes conflict formed. And Paul had to deal with that conflict. Now, Paul himself labeled himself as the least of all the apostles. He was the last of the apostles. In fact, he did not have a great track record. He wasn't in the original 12. In fact, he was going to kill the original 12. Paul's past didn't line up with where he was now. So he considered himself the least of the apostles. Yet when it came to conflict in the churches, he said, I could command you based on my position. Because I'm an apostle, I could just tell you what to do, but that's not what Paul actually did. He doesn't command it based out of his position. He knew that his positional authority could carry some weight, that they had to do what he said because he was an apostle. But that is not the authority that Paul appeals to in order to actually influence people. After pointing that out, Paul then goes back and he traces through the story of his history with the church that he's writing to, their history. He points out the places that he's loved them, the ways that he's suffered for them, the way that he has sacrificed for them and shown grace and love and compassion and mercy to them. And it's to this that Paul appeals in order to influence them. And here, Paul gives us the key of how to develop that. That's the moral authority that Paul led with. And here he tells us how he achieves that moral authority. He talks about life as this big race. Everything's going toward the goal. Everything's going toward the end of this race, to the end of this boxing match. But when an athlete that is in the games, so the games were a big deal in Roman culture. We have a picture of a couple of the boxers up here, a famous impression on a piece of pottery. You can see that they have the gauntlets wrapped around, and the boxers, it was interesting. So their boxing was probably less like our contemporary boxing, and actually a little bit more like our mixed martial arts activities right now. It was quite brutal, actually. In one of the versions of boxing that they had, the only off-limit rule was no eye gouging. Like literally everything else was on the table. This is a serious competition, okay? And sometimes I like to think that I'm going to get into these kind of athletics. Like if I were to enter into a sport, like it would actually be a combat sport. I wrestled for a long time, and so I'm thinking like I would get into one of those combat sports, but then I think about somebody trying to like kill me, and the only thing they can't do is gouge my eyes. I'm like, you know what? I'm out. Actually, I think I'm pretty good. This is a big deal. This is significant. In fact, the athletes that would enter into it knew what was at stake. They knew that this was a serious competition, and it took months of training. Think athletic, Olympic competition. This is where the Olympic Games developed from, and it has always been an intense process. And Paul draws the metaphor of this athletic training out of the culture and puts it into the development of our character, our spirituality, and our following of Jesus. Because the boxers and the runners, they would train for months, a minimum of 6 months. Because they knew they were going to step into the ring, and especially the boxers knew somebody was going to really try to hurt them. And if their training was not up to par, it would be proven in that moment. In the moment of competition, if they waited until the moment of competition to give this boxing thing a try, they were going to lose horribly. The reality is some of us treat life like that. We think that when the trial or when the temptation comes, I'm going to resist it then. But we have not been training like an athlete who knows that serious stakes are at play. That's what Paul draws out. He says, I don't fight like a boxer beating the air. You know, when somebody really wants to hurt you, shadow boxing may look impressive. It doesn't do a thing in the ring. Beating the air, shadow boxing, just punching and getting fast fists, it can look impressive from the outside. It looks skillful, but it doesn't do anything in the moment of competition. Paul says, if I were to train like that, I would be disqualified after preaching. So he says, I strike a blow to my body, though he's not talking about actually physically hurting himself. He's talking about discipline that comes out of this metaphor of being a boxer. He talks about striking a blow to his body. He's talking about disciplining it in such a way that it brings about mental toughness. It brings about a spiritual fervor and tenacity. He talks about actually having trained his physical body. They did not separate spiritual from physical. There was no division there the way we do. It was holistic. So when Paul talks about training his body, he's talking about his whole self. His body, soul, spirit, his mind, his mental capacities, he trains those so that when he preaches to others, he himself will not be disqualified from the prize. You see, what Paul points out is if he teaches and he tells people what to do based out of his positional authority, then when it comes time for people to see the way he lives, he will be disqualified because his character will be revealed. If Paul relies on his position to influence others, they are going to see right through and see what is the real him. So he disciplines himself, he trains himself, he develops these habits, he develops these patterns, he develops these ways of living patterned in the person of Jesus so that what he does lines up with what he preaches. This is how we develop moral authority. This is how we close the gap between what we say we want to do and what we actually do. This is how our character brings authority, and this is how we develop our character. For centuries, the church has accomplished this through the practice of spiritual disciplines. For centuries, passed down from age to age to age, from person to person, discipleship tool passed on down the line has been spiritual disciplines. These are things that train our character so that when the day of competition comes, we won't be found wanting. Spiritual disciplines train us body, soul, spirit, mind, and heart. Any kind of division that you want to make in yourself, spiritual disciplines train that. It's like striking blows to your body to prepare for the day of competition. This is at the core of who we will be and what we are committed to going forward. This is the way that we will be using tools of spiritual disciplines to help disciple those that are behind us and that those ahead of us can teach us and help us learn from. They can help develop our character so that we too can stand up in the middle of people with positional authority, yet be listened to. There will be others around us who, because of their position, because of their power, will be able to draw a crowd or have influence or maybe have the little blue check mark next to their name on Facebook because now you follow them instead of friending them. Or maybe they have so many likes on Instagram, right? This doesn't have to be massive positions of power. These are places of power in our culture because they have a large following, a large crowd. but it doesn't hold up. The day of competition will come, the day of revealing will happen, and who they are will be seen in reality. The same is true for us. It doesn't matter whether we have a massive following or whether our sphere of influence is limited to our kids and our friends or our coworkers or those who we manage at work, or maybe you're a CEO or a business owner or whatever it is. You have position, but we need to develop the character, because who we are will be revealed, and spiritual disciplines are one of the tools we're using as a family to get there. Dallas Willard says this about spiritual disciplines. A discipline is an activity within our power, something we can do, which brings us to a point where we can do what we at present cannot do by direct effort. Let's read that again. A discipline is an activity within our power, or something we can do, which brings us to the point where we can do what we present cannot do by direct effort. Right? So what Willard is saying here is that spiritual disciplines are this daily training so that when the competition comes, if we were just to step into that point of testing or that point of trial or into that temptation and then we decided to give it a try, we would fail horribly. Our character is not developed yet. But spiritual disciplines help us say no to certain things or say yes to certain things in the moment that we are capable of doing, so that when that more difficult moment comes, we can say no in that moment. When that trial comes, we can stand up under it. When the temptation comes, we can say no to it. That is what this training does for us. It's like an athlete. It's like muscle memory. Spiritual disciplines in and of themselves don't make us closer to Jesus, but what they do is they open up the way in our heart. They open up the space. It's like when we talked about tilling the soil of our lives. Spiritual disciplines help us till the soil of our lives so that the kingdom has a rich soil to take root in. And it can grow, and then it can bear fruit. The presence of God can be found in those moments when we discipline ourselves, when we structure our lives in such a way that it allows for it. It's this practice that helps us become who we want to be. It's this practice that helps us focus more on our being than our doing. Our culture celebrates doing. It celebrates glitz and glam. It celebrates talent. It celebrates skill. But oftentimes, those who find themselves in that place, it's only a matter of time before who they are revealed matters. It's made aware, and they fall. And maybe it's a short fall, maybe it's a big fall, but it happens. Because we have to be more concerned about who we are becoming than what we're doing. Leadership expert Carey Nieuwhof likes to say it this way: you have to work twice as hard on your character than you do on your competency. Work twice as hard on your character and developing that. Work twice as hard at your training, your body, spirit, and mind. Train those things because it transforms the inside. Again, Willard says this: the aim of disciplines in the spiritual life, and specifically in the following of Christ, is the transformation of the total state of the soul. It is the renewal of the whole person from the inside. You see, Jesus' authority, Paul's authority, any authority in the church has always been birthed from the inside. It doesn't matter what change needs to be made. The answer is, does your character accomplish it? Is your character in the place that you can step into? We cannot let our skills, we cannot let our competencies take us where our character has no business being. Flip that around, though. We have to step into places that our character is needed. We have to step into those relationships where our character holds weight. We have to step into those places where moral authority is needed for a change. And I'm asking us to, as a family, as a church, to pursue these spiritual disciplines. It's what we're going to be starting in just less than a month. Starting in March, the first Tuesday in March, we are gathering to start practicing these together. Not just talking about spiritual disciplines, not just learning about 6 spiritual disciplines, but actually gathering together with a community that will keep us accountable to and help us live in grace as we practice out a different way of life. A different set of practices, one that actually forms us inwardly. One that's less focused on our skill, and one that's more like a boxer training for a competition. one that helps us develop character that brings authority. Because if we want to see renewal, if we want to see revival, we have to develop this. So what I want to ask you today, I'm going to leave you with just a few questions, is first, have you relied on your skills to take you forward in life? Have you relied on your connections to lead you forward in life? Have you relied on this positional authority to take you forward in life? Or are you a person who is developing the character, a character that carries weight? And if spiritual authority, this moral authority, is needed in our day, do you have a plan to get there? If you have a plan, great. I hope your plan is working. But for the rest of us who may be a little bit confused and a little bit unclear about how to step forward, we want to help you develop that plan. We want to help you develop a set of practices that takes you forward. We want to help you work harder on your character. The world will help you develop skill. We want to be character builders. It always made me a little bit upset in youth ministry when I would talk to parents about kids participating in something that would help develop their character. And they said, yeah, but they're in sports to develop their character. There should be no better character building machine than the church. If there is a better character building machine than the church, we have failed horribly. So, if moral authority is what is needed, do you have a plan to build it? Let's pray.